Dear viewers, today I have somber breaking news to report to you. U.S. presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has brain worms. Well, had. Brain worm, singular. But I am not being sarcastic for once. RFK Jr. literally said that a worm got into his brain somehow, took a big old bite out of it, and then died. According to the New York Times, in a deposition during his divorce proceedings, he volunteered that a doctor had informed him in 2010 that he had a dead parasite in his head. The doctor believed that the abnormality seen on his scans was, quote, caused by a worm that got into my brain and ate a portion of it and then died, Mr. Kennedy said in the deposition. Look, I'll be honest with you about a number of embarrassing things. First, I've been laughing about this really hard for a long time, since the second I read it. I needed a few hours to recover before I could even sit down and make this video. Second, he has brain worms has become such an apt epithet for people like RFK Jr. that for a minute, my first thought was, hold on, brain worms are real? And then I remembered that, yes, of course, there are parasites that can and do infect the brain. But in that same deposition, RFK Jr. also claimed that at the same time as the discovery of the dead brainworm, he also was suffering from mercury poisoning. I have to admit, this immediately triggered my bullshit detector. I mean, the name RFK Jr. triggers my bullshit detector. He has spent several decades fear-mongering about mercury in vaccines, claiming that they can cause serious problems when given to children, which is patently untrue. We have reams and reams of data showing that it's untrue. And yet, thimerosal, mercury, has been taken out of vaccines anyway. But, anti-vaccine activists gonna anti-vaccine. So with my skepticism in mind, I was wondering, what are the odds that he actually was harmed by mercury at the very same time that a dead worm was rotten in his noggin? So I finished my lunch and then I started researching because what I'm about to tell you is disgusting. But I'm pretty sure you're not going to be surprised by the fact that I'm pretty sure RFK Jr. is lying about something here. Also, this incredibly stupid and hilarious news story has led me to learning something important about my own health. And for that, I have to say, thanks, RFK Jr. Ugh. Should take a break and take a shower or something. So yes, parasitic worms can and do infect the brain. The one I thought of first, despite it not being particularly wormy, is the brain-eating amoeba, aka Naegleria fowleri. That microscopic jerk is the reason why you should always boil tap water before you put it in a neti pot to clear out your sinuses. Drinking him will not hurt you, but if you shoot him straight up your nose, he's going to head straight for your brain and start chowing down like it's an all-you-can-eat gray buffet. But RFK Jr. didn't have N. fowleri, which I know because he's still alive. The infection it causes is incredibly rare, but also extremely fatal. In the 50 years before RFK Jr.'s supposed infection, 128 people in the U.S. had caught this, and only 2 survived. So I wanted to know what other worms and parasites can get into our brains. And I was surprised to discover that by far the most common in the Western world, at least, is, believe it or not, Tinea cilium, the same parasite you can get from eating undercooked pork. That's right, it's the humble tapeworm, not just a budget Ozempic. The pork tapeworm is well known for infecting the small intestine, but it turns out that it can infect any soft tissue in your body, and it's particularly fond of the eyes and brain. When it does make its way to the brain, it can lead to seizures, headaches, brain lesions, dementia, even death. In fact, according to the CDC, the pork tapeworm is actually the #1 cause of adult onset epilepsy in the world. Despite how relatively common it is, it's still pretty rare in places with stricter food standards like in the United States, because we tend to cook our pork thoroughly, wash our hands, things like that. But RFK Jr. says he may have picked it up during a trip to South Asia. That's certainly possible, but what's not possible is his claim that the parasite ate a portion of his brain. Unlike the brain-eating amoeba, the pork tapeworm absorbs nutrients from its surroundings, which is why the ones that end up in the brain are actually usually much tinier than their greedy cousins in the intestine. They don't get as many nutrients. So unfortunately, while it is very funny that RFK Jr. says a worm literally ate his brain, it's just not true. It really pains me to fact check that one. Might some other worm have eaten his brain? As far as my research could turn up, the only other options are other forms of tapeworm and parasitic flatworms known as flukes, which cause swimmer's itch most commonly, but it can also get into the brain. The problem isn't from them eating the brain, though. As with tapeworms, it's from the inflammation and the tissue development your brain undergoes in order to try to protect itself from this foreign intruder. Oh, and before I move on, I do need to mention this. I looked it up just in case. The treatment for having any type of parasitic worm in your brain is not, in fact, ivermectin. Sorry. Another good joke goes straight down the drain. Finally, I want to talk about the mercury poisoning claim. Is it possible that RFK Jr. had it? This may surprise you, but the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, it's possible. Lots of things are possible, even if extremely rare. Bobby says he was eating loads and loads of tuna at the time, and tuna is an apex predator. Mercury is lurking in all fish, and it accumulates as little fish are eaten up by bigger fish, and eventually, the biggest fish, like tuna, eat those fish, and with it, they get that giant dose of mercury, and then we eat it and we get the mercury. That's why the FDA offers advice that we should avoid those apex predators. Tuna, swordfish, sharks, and marlins are all on the avoid list, while the little guys like anchovies can safely be eaten 2 to 3 times a week. Not for most people, though. Just for people who are pregnant, breastfeeding, or children. They base their recommendations on these populations because the mercury we get from fish is only really dangerous for tiny developing brains, unless you're consuming absolute batshit amounts of apex fish. Because the human body does eventually process out the mercury, it just takes a little bit of time. So long as you're not just pounding tuna fish at the all-you-can-eat sushi buffet, you're probably going to be fine if you're an adult. In kids, elevated mercury levels can lead to really serious problems, cognition problems, and a host of other bad things like kidney problems. In adults, though, it has a much subtler effect. Depending on how much mercury an adult consumes, they may experience things like muscle weakness and tingling, problems with cognition like memory loss. But at low levels, even levels that exceed the FDA's recommendation, which again is based upon what's safe for children and fetuses, the data showing harm is mixed. For instance, a study of 920 young adults in Japan compared mercury levels in their hair with neurobehavioral performance and brain structure, and they found that greater hair mercury levels were weakly but significantly associated with diminished cognitive performance. Now, was that due to the mercury they were currently ingesting as young adults, or did those young adults with more mercury also tend to ingest more mercury as younger kids? And that's why they found such a weak correlation. Maybe that result was just the remnant of high mercury kids growing up and changing their habits or moving around, diluting the effect. Because in a study years earlier, another group of researchers examined the mercury levels in the blood of 474 older patients in Baltimore, Maryland, and looked to see how they matched up with their scores on 12 cognitive ability tests. The only significant results they found was that elevated mercury levels were correlated with poorer performance on one test of visual memory, but that they were also coordinated with better performance on tests of motor speed, hand-eye coordination, and manual dexterity. Overall, they wrote, the data do not provide strong evidence that blood mercury levels are associated with worse neurobehavioral performance in this population of older urban adults. That doesn't mean that mercury is perfectly fine for adults to consume in any quantity. It may be that some people are more negatively affected than others, and or that the negative effects may be subtle and difficult to identify in studies studying large populations. The research is overwhelming that very large doses of mercury in adults can cause serious damage, but that's extremely rare in the United States because it happens most often when workers are exposed doing jobs like mining gold, or when industries dump large amounts of mercury into communities, as happened in Minamata, Japan, when a chemical company spent decades poisoning the ocean with their mercury waste, leading to tens of thousands of injuries and about 5,000 people suspected to be killed. But RFK Jr. had mercury poisoning from eating too much tuna. Okay, sure. He said he had levels 10 times the FDA recommendation, which, again, is for fetuses and children only, and that it led to severe cognitive problems. Sure, maybe this poor man, in a span of just a year or so, had a worm eat part of his brain and die, got mercury poisoning, and also went through a highly contentious divorce in which his soon-to-be ex-wife wanted to take all of his money, which was now down to a mere pittance because of the aforementioned brain worms and mercury poisoning. Oh, right. That's how it all came up, by the way. The deposition RFK Jr. gave was in his divorce from his second wife, Mary Richardson, and he was listing off his cognitive problems because he claimed that they impacted his earnings, so he couldn't pay the spousal support that she wanted. Weird that it was a huge problem back then, but now that Richardson is dead, she killed herself before the divorce was finalized, and poor cognitive ability would hurt rather than help Bobby's financial future in a run for the presidency. Now the mercury poisoning is gone, and the part of the brain that the worm ate has grown back, and according to his spokesperson, he's just fine. Just fine. Thanks for asking. So now, if it wasn't clear already, I don't buy all of this. I think, sure, he may have had a dead parasite in his brain. Absolutely sure. And I also think that he was obsessed with mercury at the time, so he went to his doctor and got some blood work done, found that his levels were elevated, and used that as a nifty excuse to try to pay his ex-wife less money. Just a guess on my part, though. I mentioned, though, that I learned something about my own health. Well, I've been trying to increase my protein intake over the past 6 months or so in order to increase my muscle mass. And as a pescatarian who mostly eats vegetarian, the laziest way to do that was to just increase the amount of canned tuna I was eating. Light tuna in cans is usually skipjack, which is a small tuna with a comparatively small amount of mercury on average, which is why it's on the FDA's okay for fetuses list. But the last time my partner came home from the grocery store, he had grabbed a different brand, and it was albacore. I didn't think there was much of a difference, but it turns out there is. Albacore is a much larger tuna with potentially more mercury in it. And I've been eating it for lunch a lot. Like 5 times a week, a lot. Is that bad? Maybe. I'm not worried I have mercury poisoning, but at the end of the day, mercury is not good for us. So I'm going to help myself out and also help the environment out because, eating an apex predator has never been the sustainable choice. And I'm going to switch back to the light stuff while also doing a few extra minutes of effort and making lunches with things like lentils. Those of you in the audience, let me know if you have any favorite high-protein veggie lunches. And children and fetuses in the audience, skip the tuna entirely. Hit up those anchovies. All the omega-3s, much less mercury. Hold on. Fetuses, get off this channel. You're going to get me demonetized, for God's sake. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you loved the video, please subscribe. And if you think the world could use more videos like this and you happen to have a few bucks laying around, head to patreon.com/Rebecca and join an awesome community of nerds like the people whose names you see on the screen right now. Thanks.